Welcome to the Architecture of the Marginalized, a presentation by myself, Chelsea Vickers, for my final assignment in Social Justice for the Built Environment at Yorkville University. This presentation examines the factors needed to support marginalized populations across the world in architecture, interior design, and community planning. Coming up, we will look at the current pitfalls and how we can create inclusivity, establish equity, and how to provide for the underprivileged communities through research and case studies. We will explore the highs and lows of the issues and determine how we can improve to make a greater impact. With this presentation, I hope to provide a greater understanding of our work as designers and how we can infiltrate change into the society and our global community. In an interview with Baratunde Thurston, producer, storyteller, and creator of the podcast How to Citizen, a social justice movement that reclaims the collective power in the United States, he explains our responsibilities as designers and the impact that we can make on society. He says, designers have a lot of power in shaping communities. They can determine the literal physical constraints of life, how we move about our shared spaces, how much light we have access to. Designers can drop us into an abyss or create experiences that welcome us lovingly into a community. A designer's powers can be used for good or ill depending on how well the designer works with the community they are trying to shape. Is that shape consensual or imposed by the needs of the few? Is that shape open to change after the community has had experience in it? First off, let's start with what is marginalization? You can see here in Figure 1 highlighting the disadvantaged groups and their barriers. This happens in every country all across the world. These are populations that are normally born into circumstances that put them at risk of poverty due to their limited access to economic opportunities, as well as being politically, socially, and culturally oppressed. The historical narrative on these populations is lacking in education systems, and they have a much more difficult time accessing higher levels in industries and institutions worldwide. Even though many industries are now open and aware of issues of marginalization, these populations are still underrepresented and therefore have minimal impact in changing the issues at hand. You can see here in Figure 2 a survey done by the American Institute of Architecture in 2016 how women are perceived as underrepresented in the field of architecture. The reasons for this is due to the difficulties women face in entering into the field and remaining in the field due to the system not being supportive of their specific needs. Over the last 50 years, the American Institute of Architects has funded at least 4 separate diversity committees for diversity conferences, retains a diversity office, and has compiled their own data and statistics on diversity within their own ranks, but has fallen short in representation over the decades. The resolution of the institution is to provide financial scholarships and grants to those already committed within the profession, with no real committed support systems beyond their organizational boundaries. The limitations are much more complex than we realize, and until marginalization is concretely understood and more thoroughly investigated from its origins, we will still fall short. What does marginalization look like? From here, we will take a look at a few case studies where the marginalized community is struggling, from displaced communities through the economic struggle of slums, tent cities, and illegal encampments to racial zoning and gentrification. Those marginalized within poverty can be right in front of you, integrated into every neighborhood, or pushed to the outskirts of town. When I was visiting India, I could not help but notice the extreme poverty at the foot of every skyscraper or hotel. As closely integrated as they were, they lived completely separate lives right under our noses. The rich are right next to the poor in many communities around the world. In the first image, Figure 4, you can see 2 economically different neighborhoods side by side in Mexico. In Figure 5, slums at the foot of apartment buildings in India, and tent cities among the green space of neighborhoods in Canada for Figure 6. Each of these locations struggle to have running water, electricity, and proper protection from the elements. This was something that was so obvious to me when seen in a foreign country, until I realized it is just as prevalent here in North America, just visually different. Another personal example comes to mind from traveling on the freeway through Washington, D.C. I noticed the poor quality of homes and vehicles on my way into the city, and then suddenly was surrounded by extreme wealth. It was visibly evident that the downtown core was very wealthy and predominantly white, while the encircling communities were visibly run down and predominantly non-white. Historically, this racial zoning was organized through allowing only certain neighborhoods to have mortgages to which they can only rent to people of certain ethnicities, as seen in Figure 7. Here, an example of a mortgage copy eventually made illegal by 1948. There is an organization in Washington called the Greater Washington that seeks to link together the urban community through investigating the historical segregation issues to make connections with why the outer communities are still marginalized. They have found that educational districts establish their zoning to reflect the same racist urban planning of 100 years ago. It is still very evident that the better schools, community centers, and city services are still only in the neighborhoods whose residents maintain a higher tax bracket.
Cities all over the country made maps like this one. This is DC's map from 1936, and the colors are still used today. These yellow areas here are areas that are the most restrictive. You can only build single family homes. The brown areas, a little bit less so. The red areas, you can build maybe more of a mix of row houses and some commercial activities, and the purple areas are even less restrictive. The next tool was redlining. Following the Great Depression, the federal government wanted to find ways to basically to insure people's mortgages so they wouldn't lose their homes. And one of the tools used to determine who could have access to these government backed mortgages and in what areas was called redlining. There were maps like this made of cities all over the country. This is DC's map, and it shows Maryland and Virginia as well. The darker colored areas here are rated A, B, and C. These are generally the communities that have the highest end housing and are exclusively white neighborhoods. You can see a pattern emerge. Other areas had lower grades like C, D, E, um, F. These were in general white neighborhoods that were working or middle class. And then finally, the lowest grade of neighborhoods like H were black neighborhoods. And those were neighborhoods, all these lighter colored neighborhoods are basically increasingly off limits to um, mortgages and the opportunity to build generational wealth that comes with it. And even though redlining as a practice was outlawed in 1977, again, these tools all sort of converge to create a pattern that we still see in our schools today. This is a zoom in of the inside of the Otway part of Montgomery County. This is that map from 1936. Here's a map from 80 years later showing the racial makeup of those same neighborhoods. You can see what these neighborhoods were graded on a map in 1936. And the split is very clear, right? And that tracks with median household income. And it's so fine grained. And that tracks with home values. These were the areas on the left hand side that 80, 90 years ago, the federal government said these are the highest end neighborhoods. And today, they remain as such.
A more potent example of racial zoning and historical segregation would be post apartheid South Africa, where racial segregation in urban planning was made illegal only recently. Here we hear from Wandile Mithyane, an architect for social justice who studies apartheid architecture in his country of South Africa.
So what they did was they came up with this thing called the 40-40 rule. So where they would build a 40 square meter home, which would be a labor camp for the majority of the people, black people in South Africa, place it 40 kilometers away from town where sort of the white masters lived, and then devoid those opportunities of economic opportunities and gathering places because those will have political implications with them. The laws might have changed, but the architecture didn't. So people are still spending 40% of their income commuting to work in town today, which then renders them incapable of developing their own homes and their own communities.
Ironically, after we segregate populations into more undesirable neighborhoods, we are now coming in since the 1960s with urban renewal and gentrification, making these neighborhoods more desirable and then increasing their cost of living and pushing the marginalized out again. Gentrification is systematically racist, ageist, and disableist, affecting the lower income class, and is unfortunately legal and unavoidable. Architects all over the world agree that gentrification is synonymous with displacement. In 2004, the New York City Authority held a design competition for submissions on an abandoned railway, an infrastructure called the High Line that bridged West Manhattan. With 720 applicants given absolutely no limits, they submitted their wildest dreams of what to do with the space. The winning design was the ultimate and now famous green space pedestrian walkway and park spanning 1.45 miles long. This beautiful public space became the historical beginnings of the gentrification of West Manhattan. Its construction signaled urban developers to seek new investments. With its greatest intentions, they brought in the most beautiful architecture and green landscaping that became so popular that it skyrocketed the cost of living. One of the main architects of the High Line, Liz Diller, speaks out about the effect the High Line had on the area.
Looking back on that period, there could have been legislation then to make sure that there was more equity in the way that these properties developed, and making sure that inclusionary zoning is part of the overall mix, that you can get different income levels as part of a city fabric, that you don't evict artists all of a sudden because they can't pay the rent.
With climate change causing more natural disasters across the globe, the marginalized are first to suffer and the last to receive the proper resources to rehabilitate, causing long-term suffering and instability. Impoverished areas are the most exposed to damage from natural disasters due to living in low-cost, high-risk areas with lack of infrastructure and the inability to recover financially. This draws a very strong connection between climate change and the marginalized population. Working sustainably can bring us together as a global community.
Baratunde Thurston
from How to Citizen notes, while being interviewed by Design Museum Everywhere, a new kind of museum focused on design impact. He says, as we reckon with the magnitude of the climate crisis, we are realizing that the regenerative agricultural practices of indigenous people we displaced and tried to destroy are essential to our collective survival. Those are a few historical perspectives on the potential of more BIPOC participation. Until the government starts to work towards risk management strategies that address climate change, developing locally needs to come from communities themselves. An NGO called Hug It Forward is connecting environmental uses of materials in the built environment to help alleviate poverty by providing classrooms to communities in need in Latin America.
We volunteered with an organization called Hug It Forward, and basically what we do is work on projects where we support communities with building schools out of trash. And in Guatemala, there's no waste management system, so there's trash everywhere, plastic bottles, chip wrappers, all that stuff. We work with the communities collect all that trash. They stuff the trash inside the bottles, and then the bottles go inside the walls of the schools. And we have 132 schools done. We build 2 and 3 classroom schools. The 2 classroom school requires about 6,500 eco bricks is what we call them. And then the 3 classroom school is close to 10,000 eco bricks. A big part of our projects is making sure that they're sustainable and that the community is empowered throughout the project cycle. So the first thing that they have to do is they have to collect the trash, stuff the trash in the bottles, that creates the eco bricks. And for us to fund a project, they usually have to provide about 90% of the eco bricks for the project before we even break ground, before we provide funding. So that really shows their commitment, their buy-in to the project. And then they also volunteer during the construction process as unskilled labor.
During the school build, there's an environmental education program that goes on, and we talk to the community and talk to the kids about garbage and why it's not good just to throw it anywhere. And also there's a big habit of burning garbage in the communities, especially because there's no pickup. So we talk to them about why that's not good for their lungs and their eyes and the environment in general. So a lot of times the communities come away not only with a school, but sometimes they'll use bottles afterwards and create other structures, and just they come back with more appreciation for their environment.
When building for the marginalized populations, the areas of benefit are educational facilities, healthcare facilities, and civic centers and shelters. Specifically for women's needs and their sufferings under the patriarchy, women's shelters provide a safe space for them to avoid violence and to seek a structure to build financial support. Instead of stopping there, throughout the 1900s, women's libraries have been popping up around the world, constructed by liberated women seeking to create a space solely for women's industry and infrastructure, to plan, organize, and build relationships, to continue to advocate for their own well-being. Built for women by a female architect, Claire White took on the task of defining women's architecture through a historically women's location, the Washhouses in East London, England. The Women's Library, London, is an architectural success in delineating architecture expressed in the female form. So, what does that even look like? Firstly, the architecture pays homage to the arts and crafts movement in England, with interlocking wooden structures within the space. White organized the space to be absent of hierarchy. This means that there was no central atrium within the space, more parallel circulation and corridors connecting smaller private rooms into larger circulation spaces. The way she allows space to flow in and out between rooms and overlooking into other spaces shows a complexity and intimacy that brings connectivity and communication throughout the space, characteristics of a more feminine design. While visitors to the gallery can catch a glimpse of scholars hard at work producing culture rather than just consuming it, this extensive transparency of the working areas does not stem from a need for surveillance as much as it underlines the interdependent and interlocking aspects of the building's program. Historically, women were intended to be pious, passive, and segregated. This way of building is purposeful, empowering women with connectivity, pride, and strength in hard work and communication. The entire building functions as a showcase for women's diverse roles as subjects of history, artists, interpreters, and producers. Women are active agents in this library. What needs to be addressed in order to improve? When looking historically, we have come from backgrounds of slavery and fascism in most parts of the world. In order to improve, we need to take the steps of applying equity seriously in order for us to repair our history and move into a more conscious representation of our humanity. Other concepts that are important to consider along with equity are diversity and inclusion. Understanding what diversity and inclusion looks like is seeing representation of marginalized populations at all levels, creating sustainable practices, and facilitating their success.
We started looking at different housing projects around the world, and we realized the majority of social housing projects around the world have failed. And they have failed because, for some reason, when people are designing for low-income communities, they think that they shouldn't consult them in the designing of their own home.
In order for us to find balance within our communities and our planet, we need to understand what equity means. Some people are born into or experience unforeseen circumstances that do not make them deserve any lesser than someone who was born into privilege and good luck. Until the challenge of equity is balanced in fully understanding the needs of the marginalized, we will not be able to be liberated to develop our communities as a whole. Figure 23 is a graphic from Design Museum Everywhere. It showcases the key terminology used to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sam Aquilano, founder and executive director of Design Museum Everywhere, puts it best. Good design is not possible without equity and diversity. Design is for everyone. Yet, when I was looking at my design roles in the early years of my life, I realized that most of it was being done by white guys like me. So, for design to be truly for everyone, it must be done by everyone.
When we come from a developed country like the States, like America, it's easy for us to go with our perspective and think, okay, well, they need this, they need this, they need this, and make those assumptions. That was kind of our first lesson in development work, was not assuming and really listening.
When seeking to design for the marginalized population, it is important to consider three things during the research and planning stages. Get feedback from the community, acknowledge your biases and privileges, and focus on equality of experience overall. The most important part of the design process is the planning process, and this is how we create a beautiful result with the least amount of complications. And what designers need to understand is that we are not just creating a space, we are creating a pillar of a community, an impact on society, and adding historical value into a space.
Post-occupancy, there should be a role for architects to think about, what their projects have wrought, and to be able to manage the effect in some way.
In the end, it is about creating an identity for these communities and weaving them back in to our history worldwide. We need to follow through with our work and understand the population that we are serving and how we can integrate them into society, redefining our systems and policies to include them through equity and repairing our historical roots of oppression. There are still a lot of steps to go through to create an inclusive, equitable, and diverse space, though it is not out of our reach, to include climate change and human rights into our design, and to document and analyze our work and experience, to put them into practice and to train others. Then we can create a new system implemented over time and streamlined in the same way that our limiting systems were streamlined to oppress. Acknowledging the needs of our marginalized population are in correlation with sustainability and can open up a lot more opportunities in design that we may not have ever known were possible. Thank you very much.